Thanks to Ben Miller for helping us put this together. This is Island Press's first co-sponsored briefing on the Hill. If you're not familiar with Island Press, we have been around for 30 plus years. We're based here in DC, and we publish exclusively on the environment, books and short form content through our Urban Resilience Project. And Brian is a two-time Island Press author. His most recent book is Chasing Water. He is a global leader in water science and conservation for 30 years, so well equipped to talk about these issues. He is currently the president of Sustainable Waters, a global water education organization where he promotes sustainable water use and management. He was previously the managing director of the Global Water Program at the Nature Conservancy. His new book is Chasing Water, or his recent book is Chasing Water, and he's going to talk to us about some of his research around water infrastructure. So I will toss it to you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a cool, brisk morning to talk about water. Just a real quick little bit of background about the book. So here's the cover, Chasing Water. I grew up in Southern California. I was raised in San Diego, spent my first couple of decades there, went to college there, and even when I was a kid, we had water shortages in Southern California, and that's a long time ago. And so I think that this issue of water scarcity, water shortages, mandatory water conservation, the struggles of trying to get through, dry periods has been in my life, for pretty much its entirety. And so, as Jamie said, I was fortunate enough after graduate school to be able to get into the Nature Conservancy, become a staffer in the Nature Conservancy. I was actually the first full-time water person in the Nature Conservancy, and oversaw the global water program and the growth of the water program within the Nature Conservancy over a couple of decades. And there are now more than 600 water professionals working in that organization. So it was a really, really gratifying and rewarding experience. And for me personally, and the reason for the book, I guess, was that I had the great fortune of traveling all over the world and seeing the good, bad, and ugly when it came to water. And we worked on all kinds of different water issues. And so you get to see, the firsthand where people are really, really struggling, where they're literally dehydrating and not able to get food or water. And unfortunately, there's so many people that are still struggling with that in many parts of the world, including here in the U.S., by the way. But after all of that, I thought that I would try to put my thoughts together in this book. And so it's a very, very simple introduction to water. I tried to assume nothing about my reader's background on water and tried to just kind of build a foundation. So you're going to get a little bit of that from me today. I think I'm a professor by DNA, and so there's a couple of really basic concepts that I want to make sure that everybody understands, and then we'll go into where some ideas about where I think we really need to go in the water scarce areas of the planet, and including the Western U.S. as well as other parts of the U.S. now. And but the format of this, I'm going to try and get through this in about 20 minutes because I want to leave as much time as possible to hear from all of you. I want to hear what you're concerned about, what you have questions about, and that's always the best part of the presentation for me. So let's get into it. Just wanted to start with planting the idea with all of you that about how fundamentally human beings' relationship with water shifted about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Previously, when we were a hunter-gathering society, we were not only out looking for food, but we were also out looking for water. We were traversing the landscape looking for those food and water resources. But as we made the transition into becoming a more sedentary agricultural societies, again about 10,000, 12,000 years ago in a couple of different areas around the world, our relationship changed because we were no longer going out looking for water, but in fact we were then becoming dependent upon the water coming to us. So it was sort of like we were anchored in place and dependent upon, then you become very dependent upon the vagaries of the climate within that place in which you're trying to make a living. So with that in mind, of course, over time, technologically we developed the capabilities to do some really, really amazing things with water to try to increase, to try to dampen out those those variations, in the water that was available to us in a place. So we built these large storage reservoirs, starting here in the United States. Hoover Dam at the time was the biggest dam built in the world in the early 1930s. Enabled us to buffer out not just the year-to-year variations, but of course the fact that we're using a lot of water in the summer for irrigation purposes. A lot of that water comes in a different time of the year, so being able to store water and then use it, in the seasons or in later years is really important to us. Around World War II, we really developed the technological capabilities of going way underground. We have been doing, shallow hand-dug wells in many, many places around the world, and still do, by the way. It's still a very, very important aspect of access to water in many, many places. But with the onset of industrial scale pumps, we were able to drill wells down hundreds, if not thousands of feet, and had enough of that pump energy to be able to bring it up to the surface. So we saw areas like this developed. A lot of you might know this as the Ogallala Aquifer. It's also more generally referred to, at least in the scientific community, as the High Plains Aquifer in the Midwestern United States. But very, very extensive drilling of deep groundwater wells to irrigate crops that have become immensely important to the United States and to the world. We also, though, to make my point about expecting the water to come to us, well, when there wasn't enough water coming to us, or when our needs for water extended out beyond what was available to us in the local environment, in the local area, then we developed this capability of being able to bring water in from other places, to be able to reach out to distant water sources, other aquifers, other river basins, and transport it via pipeline, canal, and that sort of thing. And so this has become very important in our relationship with water as well. It's now setting off some interesting dynamics, I think, politically, because as scarcity in certain regions around the world expands and intensifies, people are getting to be really protective, really territorial about, don't bring your straw, over into my water source, because we're going to need it for our future. But of course, these things are really important in developing the food, the food resources to be able to feed a growing population. This is the Imperial Irrigation District, one of the biggest farming districts in the United States, down in southeastern California, right on the Colorado River. Some of you know the story that if you're eating lettuce during the wintertime, the chances are very good that it's coming out of this particular farming area in Southern California. It also enabled us to grow cities in some pretty extraordinary places, like the Sonoran Desert with Phoenix here. And so we have really, to some extent, I think over the last century, taken on the mindset that we could manage water technologically or through engineering works to be able to overcome even the greatest adversity in water scarcity, such as the lack of available water within a desert environment. But those issues are all coming to roost, and that's why we're all here and why we're talking today. These graphs are hard to read, but all you need to do is see the colors and the patterns here, and I'll just walk you through this real quickly. This is, I think, the only graph that I'm going to throw at you. Basically, what you're looking at is about 100 years of time, and the variation of both water supply and water use. And it's two different places. The upper base is from the upper graph there is from the Murray-Darling Basin in southeastern Australia. The bottom one is from the Colorado River in the western United States. Both of these places have very, very similar patterns, and I could show you thousands of graphs from other rivers around the world that basically tell the same story. And that story is, of course, from year to year, you have a varying water supply. The amount of water coming down the river, the amount of water that's recharging your groundwater aquifer varies from year to year. So the light blue in the background and the bumps and ridges, there indicate that variability. The darker blue is the water use, and this is the water use that's being consumed. This is water that's taken out of the river and doesn't make it back into the river after we use it. So it's actually depleting the river or the aquifer over time. And so what we all see in these two graphs is that in the last couple of decades, those two lines have intersected for the first time. And that really is the story about what's going on in the Colorado River Basin now. Just to understand that one graph tells you an awful lot. No wonder we're having water shortages. No wonder we're now in a drier period and the lake levels in Lake Powell and in Lake Mead are dropping because there's not enough water available, enough water supply coming down the Colorado River to offset the intense, heavy demands on that available water. And so we're digging now into the storage of those big, gigantic reservoirs. Those reservoirs, by the way, collectively can store over 5 years of average river flow in the Colorado River, but they're still not big enough to get us out of this really pretty extraordinary situation that we're in now. But again, it's not just because we're in a dry period, it's because the demands on that available water supply, the water that's proximate enough or affordable enough to get to the people who need it, our demands on those water supplies has outgrown the supply. And so we're right up against the limits, and that's causing all kinds of problems economically, ecologically, politically as well. This is a map of where that problem is happening around the world. It's about 1/3 of all the rivers and all the groundwater aquifers in the world are experiencing that kind of a problem, which I'll just call water scarcity for shorthand. The different colors mean a little bit different things, but basically these are places where the communities, the users of these water supplies, have almost completely exhausted the available water supply. So more than 3/4 of the renewable water in these places is being consumed every year, and in some places it's more than 100% because they're taking all of the surface water that's available to them and they're pumping the groundwater and depleting the groundwater reserves. So they're actually overdrafting for the time being. And about 20% of the food supply on the planet is coming from those kinds of places where they are clearly out of balance and overdrafting the water accounts. The statistics there I think are very frightening. So I said about 1/3 of all the water sources on the planet, half of the world's population is dependent upon those water sources. And the one that's really of quite a bit of concern is that 3/4 of all the world's irrigated acreage. And irrigated farms are a really, really important part of the global the global food supply. And the fact that so much of that irrigated acreage is in these water scarce regions is of great concern. Got just a little bit more bad news and then we're going to shift to the positive side. So here's a blow up for the United States, a little bit of a closer view, basically telling the same story. If it's in the orange and reddish colors, the darker the red, the more heavily that water source is being depleted. And what you can see there across the western United States, but increasingly into the southeastern US, and episodically at times everywhere in the United States seems to be experiencing a water shortage or getting close to it these days. So there's an interesting statistic. So half of all the water that naturally flows down the river systems in the western United States is being consumptively used. And in 1/4 of those water sources, more than 3/4. In other words, we're basically drying up the rivers. We've already taken half, and in many of these rivers we've taken 3/4, and of course, as you all know, there are rivers, the bottom end of the Colorado River, the bottom end of the Rio Grande. Those rivers are being completely dried up on a year-to-year basis now. This is just a portrayal of the ecological consequences of this. So it's not just that we're running out of water for our farms and for our cities or to generate our electricity, but the plants and animals that live in these river systems, in the floodplain forests, in the wetland areas, are being really seriously compromised. In fact, when you talk about freshwater species endangerment here in the United States, the #1 cause has become water depletion. It's the diversions of water out of these natural water systems. And so all this is showing is the number of species. And some of those areas that are in the darker colors there, more than 20 species have become endangered, on the endangered species list, directly because of the depletion of water flows in their habitats. So these things are highly interconnected. The fate of human beings is of course intertwined with what's going on in the natural environment. All right, so here's the conclusion from that. That was the setup. That was the bad news. But the setup is there is no more surplus water. So when we talk about building new reservoirs, they don't create any new water. A friend of mine from Florida once said, you know, the thing about reservoirs, you can think about them like, you know, bank accounts or checking accounts. And he said, just because you go and open up a new checking account doesn't mean that it's going to resolve the fact that you're going bankrupt. In other words, it's just creating another account. Reservoirs are that way. If we're already using all of the available water supply, building a reservoir doesn't really help a whole lot. It can change the timing of when some water supplies are available, but we really need to come to grips with the fact that we are up against the limit. Okay, that's the punchline I want you to take away from here, is that of the available water supplies, we've pretty much exhausted them. Anything else that we take is only going to put more plants and animals deeper into endangerment and driving them to extinction. So my conclusion from looking at this all over the world, all across the Western United States throughout my career and my life, is that we now need to really aggressively focus on what we call in the water world demand management. We really need to focus on how do we shrink our existing water footprint. Not where do we go get more water on the supply side, but how do we actually shrink how much water we actually need. Now, that might sound unrealistic, it might sound very draconian to a lot of you, but the good news, I forgot I do have some more graphs. The good news is that we're already on track for doing this in the United States. So the U.S. Geological Survey, of course, keeps track of all the water use across the United States. They publish water use reports every 5 years. This is up until the last couple of weeks, and I'm anxious to get the latest data, but through 2010, this was the report for the year 2010 in the United States. It's a summation of all the water that's being used by all different purposes: irrigation, domestic use in homes and cities. The important part here is that line that's on the top, and you see that that line tracked upward with the increasing population up until the 1970s, and then the trajectory began to bend, and it actually has come back down. Our total use of water in the United States is now at about the same level as it was in the 1970s, even while we've added a substantial 50% additional population in the United States. So this is pretty remarkable, and it says, look, we're already on the right track of being able to do what I suggested we need to do to shrink our water footprints. There is, I think, besides the fact that I want you to go away, with this idea that there's no more surplus water, so we got to shift to demand management, is that there is tremendous potential. Even though we've started to bend the trajectory of our total water use in the United States, there is unbelievable amount of potential still left and available to us. So I'll give you a couple of bits of evidence for that. One is this one. So some academics out at UC Davis a couple of years ago did a report, and they looked at water use in Australian cities and compared them to cities in the Western United States. And you can see some of the totals there if you can read them for some of the Western cities. But basically their conclusion there on the right, on average, Australian cities use less than half of the amount of water being used in cities in the Western United States. So just imagine how the dynamics of our water shortages out west would be changed if we were to cut the water use in cities in half. It would be a very, very different situation. This graph here is from the Pacific Institute. A lot of you know of Peter Glick and his crew out there. They've done some amazing work. This is from just last year, as you can see, from July 2016. What those bubbles represent is the size of the bubble tells you how many customers there are. These bubbles represent water utilities, the public water suppliers in California. And the size of the bubble just tells you how many customers that particular utility is having to provide water to. The colors then tell you how much water per person, on average, those water utilities are serving. It ranges from 50 gallons per capita per day to over 500 gallons per capita per day. So the red ones there are the heavy users. So that, to me, when I looked at that map, I said, boy, we've got tremendous potential, because already there are cities that are hitting, very, very low per capita water use, 50 gallons per person, 60 gallons per person. Go look at your water bills and see where you are. And I think the gold standard is really, if you're around 60, 70 gallons per capita per day on your water bill, you're doing a good job. As are a lot of these water utilities. But the fact that there are so many water utilities, so many customers, even within California, and I could show you other things, of course, for other states within the Western U.S. or across the country, the fact that there are so many parts adjacent. So you have this adjacency where you have a water utility whose customers are consuming 50 gallons a day, immediately adjacent to a water utility whose customers are consuming 500 gallons per day. That just seems ridiculous to me. So where's the difference? The difference is in two things. It's in outdoor landscaping and toilets. The vast majority of the difference between Australia and the Western United States are those two things. In many of our cities, including a lot of the eastern cities, about half of the water use in the cities is going outside. It's going outside to support landscaping, flower gardens, vegetable gardens to some extent, but mainly to irrigate lawns. And so right there, you can cut your water use in half if you go to what's illustrated there on the top is a landscape that's entirely supported by rainfall. It's native landscaping or drought-tolerant landscaping that's able to get by without having to be supplementally irrigated. The toilets, the Australians got into the 2-button toilet a long time ago, and it actually makes a lot of difference in those city differences between Australia and the United States. The picture on the right I took a couple weeks ago. I was in a restaurant somewhere out in the west, and what you see is still the old plumbing fixture is still on the wall. It's a waterless urinal, and so it doesn't require any water anymore. But they still had the old water, hookup hanging out of the wall there. I thought that was kind of a cool picture. Another really important development that's happening in a number of cities is they're getting better and better about recycling their water. So this is sort of, it is in a way you could think about this as a different water supply, but it's basically reusing water internally within the city. So they're treating the water to sufficient quality and then using it for a variety of purposes. And that's going to be a big part of cities being able to get their water use down to the target levels that I was suggesting. So this is from LA. It's just a fountain here for recirculated water use, but increasingly we're seeing cities that are going to either direct reuse of treated wastewater, meaning it goes right into the taps again, or it's indirect, which means they might put it in a groundwater aquifer after they treat the wastewater and then pump it out of the aquifer. They might put it in a big surface reservoir and let it sit in the reservoir for a little while before they take it out. Psychologically, for some reason, that makes people a lot more comfortable drinking wastewater if you just kind of like put it somewhere else for a little while before you take it out again. Stormwater capture is another area that's really interesting to watch in the cities. Stormwater's been a major problem for cities all around the world. As we harden up the surface of the landscape and put a lot of pavement, asphalt, parking lots, buildings, we greatly increase the way that when water falls out of the sky as rain, it very quickly gets shunted, into the local rivers and streams and creeks. And that's been a problem because it creates a lot of damage. It needs a lot of infrastructure to be able to manage that well. But a lot of cities are starting to switch in their mindset, and they're going to this thought that, hey, maybe we could actually use some of that accentuated runoff, that problematic runoff, that problematic storm flow, and capture it and reuse it. In essence, recycle it, in a different sort of a way. But I can't miss making a really big point about the potential in irrigated agriculture. So in the Western United States, 80 to 85% of the water consumed in the Western U.S. is going to irrigated agriculture. It's going to our farms. That water, those farms are, of course, we all depend upon those farms. We all eat the food that's being produced. A lot of that food and other products, including products like cotton, get shipped to other parts of the world, and they're really important to the health and well-being of communities literally around the world. But it is a very, very big water user. And again, there's a lot of good news here. My research group at the University of Virginia has done extensive work on the real potential for reducing the amount of water use in irrigation while keeping productivity the same or increasing it. And there's a lot of potential. It's not that difficult to save a quarter to half or even more of the water that's presently being consumed by going to more efficient irrigation equipment, using technologies to really track how much moisture is in the soil, or climate stations when there's, how much rain has fallen and that sort of thing, and which is suggested here by some of the instrumentation. And there is a tremendous amount of potential. And the way that I think about this is a very small increment of savings in irrigated agriculture, because irrigated agriculture is the big bucket of water use. Just a really small amount of improvement there translates into giant volumes of water. Okay. The one last point I want to make about all of this is investing in demand management is by far and away the most cost-effective way of dealing with a water scarcity issue. It's about 1/10 of most of the other approaches. If you talk about desalinating water, water recycling, even though I made a big point about it, you have to be careful with it because it requires a lot of energy, and that energy has a lot of cost associated with it. Where we're going with that now is that presently we're treating wastewater, even if the water is going to be recycled and used out on a golf course or a commercial lawn or for a recirculating fountain, we treat it to drinking water quality. And if instead we only treated it to a level that's appropriate for the end use, we would be saving a lot of energy, we'd be saving a lot of electricity, and that would bring the cost way down. But overall, all these other things that I've been talking about, water conservation programs in urban areas, water conservation out on the farms, by far and away the most cost-effective way of dealing with this problem. And that's where we should be making our major investments. The one last point I'll make before I hit on a couple of specific recommendations is, I've talked about cities and farms as though they're kind of different universes. And in fact, culturally and politically, to some extent economically, they have been different universes. They don't get along very well with each other, to be honest with you. I spent my life out in the western United States, spent a lot of time in rural communities, as well as in cities. And you hear the farmers talk about all the water being wasted in pools and fountains and that sort of thing in the cities, and you hear the cities pointing the finger and saying, boy, that's where all the water's going. It's going out on the farm, and they're so wasteful with it. There are some great signs of hope. There's some real breakthroughs that are happening out there in the rural communities and cities out in the West, in particular, where the farmers and the city leaders and managers are starting to talk to each other in productive, collaborative ways. Just one to illustrate the point and some of the potential here real quickly. City of San Diego, where I grew up. When I was there up until my teens, early 20s, we were importing about 92% of all of our water from somewhere else. We took it out of the Colorado River, we took it from Northern California through the State Water Project, we took it out of other far distant basins and brought it into San Diego because we'd exhausted our local water supply. But San Diego has been in a mind shift. Los Angeles is going through some revolutionary thinking, I think, on water these days. San Francisco, very, very progressive. I could go on many other Western cities, not to just myopically focus on California. A lot of good work being done in San Antonio, Tucson, many, many communities. Almost all of them are doing some of what I'm talking about to some extent. My point being that we need to do a lot more of it. San Diego had a mind shift, and they said, we've got this Imperial Irrigation District just out to the east of us. We already have the infrastructure to convey water from them. Why don't we develop a partnership with the Imperial Irrigation District and incentivize them to save some of the water out on their farms? In exchange, we would get to use some of the water that the farmers were entitled to by bringing it over into San Diego for San Diego's water supply. They pay the farmers about $60 million per year right now on average. The farmers are in control, and this is a very, very important part of these urban-rural relationships. The farmers remain in control. The farmers decide how they're going to save the water. They're just getting the financial incentives from the cities to do it. If they decide they're going to fallow some of the crops on a given basis, if they're going to change their irrigation equipment, if they're going to line their canals, whatever, the farmers get to decide how that's going to be done. And that's a really, really important part of this political dynamic. So the farmers improve their water use in some way. The savings coming off of the Imperial Irrigation District now is 1/3 of all of San Diego's water supply. And it's a very, very cost-effective water supply for the city. And so you see a number of the cities in the West that are working out these kinds of relationships. There have been some bumps and some hiccups and some problems in these transactions historically. I think we've learned a lot from some of those mistakes, and I think we can do it a lot better now going forward. So, let me conclude. I'm just going to go through these quickly so that we'll have some time to talk about them, or whatever you want to talk about. So we're talking about infrastructure investment these days. Maybe there's going to be a lot of money made available for that. I really hope that a lot of the water-related infrastructure goes into the things that I was talking about, goes into enabling the recycling of water within urban areas, goes into stormwater capture and that sort of thing. I think that we've used federal grants to, through state revolving funds and that sort of thing to great effect to help cities build wastewater treatment plants historically over the last few decades. I think we can do a lot to enable them to move into the 21st century and to start to adopt some of these advanced demand management practices. The EPA WaterSense program is really, really important. I know it was on the bubble for a little while recently. It's really important. I just bought a washing machine last week and I had to replace mine. And I went to the EPA WaterSense ratings on the washing machines as my guide to which machine I was going to buy. And there's an awful lot of consumers that are paying attention as they should be, and that's an important part of this transition into really getting into demand management. The cities also need some help with staffing. They need water conservation expertise. The cities that are jumping out of front and really demonstrating some leadership, it's because they had the resources to be able to put some people on staff who really understood how to do that, who understood how to do the cost effectiveness analyses, who knew what the proven technologies and engineering results were associated with different demand management approaches, and that's a very important part. So we need to think about how can we incentivize that within some of the urban areas. On farms, we need to expand the support for programs that can help improve irrigation efficiency and reduce their water use. A couple of federal programs already do that and are being tapped, but we need to exponentially increase. So things like CREP, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, is doing a lot of good work out on farms and providing incentives for farmers to save water. EQIP has also been important. Environmental Quality Incentive Program, did I get that right? And those are programs that need to be not maintained at the same level, they need to be greatly increased because we need to really get this demand management and rebalancing of the water budget under control. The funding to support the acquisition, sometimes the retirement of water rights can be important. Australia's done this on a huge scale. In that one river basin, the Murray-Darling Basin, they put $10 billion on the table to buy back water from the farmers to try to get the water budget back into balance. Without, by the way, compromising their overall agricultural productivity. So they were able to reduce the total consumptive use of water by 20% and maintain their agricultural productivity, but it took federal Commonwealth funding to be able to do it there. I'm not suggesting that's the way to do it here, but it's something that should be on the table and should be talked about, whether it's at the federal or state level. We need to get that water use down, and we need to figure out how to financially incentivize that to happen. Last, I think support for interstate programs. I think the federal government can play an important role here. Negotiations between states in the Colorado River Basin, for example, but there's an awful lot of rivers that cross state boundaries, and they really need a lot of help in trying to negotiate and come up with a shared vision, a shared plan for how collectively they can get that total water use back down to a more sustainable level. So thank you for letting me ramble at fast speed there, and I'm really anxious to hear from all of you. So thanks. Yes?
I have a brief question. I know I see South Africa in the news, Cape Town, especially this 0 day issue coming up.
Yep.
I mean, how much of that is a political issue for them that has caused this? What are the short-term and long-term solutions? Is there anything that the U.S. government can do? Curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so, South Africa is really interesting in the governance context because some of you know the story about when Nelson Mandela came into power in 1994. He hired a human rights attorney by the name of Cotter Osmal to be his water minister. And Cotter worked with a lot of the scientists, the attorneys, the social activists, the human rights groups across South Africa, and they came up with what still stands as probably the most extraordinary National Water Act that was passed in 1998. Extraordinary because it did two things. It said that we are going to ensure that every single individual has access to clean, safe drinking water supply in the country. But two, they said, we're also going to make sure that nature still has enough water to sustain the health of those ecosystems because we understand that our populations depend upon the health of those systems. They eat the fish, they harvest plants, but they also use them for many, many other purposes, even recreational, aesthetic, and spiritual connections to those water sources. So that's the governance backdrop of all of this. And there has been, and what they called for is to do, they call them catchments instead of watersheds there. The National Water Act called for them to do individual catchment water management plans. And they did them for many of the basins across South Africa. The problem has been in the implementation. They don't have the resources to be able to implement this extraordinary visionary plan at the national or at the catchment level. And so they're really struggling. Cape Town specifically is a problem of some large water users being not just reluctant but resistant to cutting back on their water use. Sort of in denial. They're kind of like playing a game of, make me do it. And so, whether they've got the regulatory capabilities of being able to push on them, they have, of course, tried the carrot side and the incentive side, but that's what's really happening in the backdrop, as I understand it right now, is that, in the poorer sectors of that community, of course, that's not the issue. I mean, they've got like one well for, a community of hundreds of people, and so they're using a very, very meager amount of water per person per day. It's really in the bigger water uses, out on the farms that surround the city, as well as in some of the big commercial uses. So somehow they've got to get that under control. Yeah.
Would you say that water storages and reservoirs are sustainable?
That reservoirs are sustainable?
And water storages.
And water?
And water storage.
Oh, water storage. Okay. They can be. They can be. That's a big caveat. So, one of the real issues, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is that our water infrastructure in this country was built under a climate regime that is changing pretty substantially. And so, when engineers design the capacity of a storage reservoir, it's based on whatever history of data, of evidence they have about how much water is going to be available, and balancing that against the demands. So in other words, they're trying to balance the water budget with these storages. One of the big issues is that the climate is changing, and in the western U.S., this is a very, very big issue. They are projecting that in places like the Colorado River Basin, that the future water availability is going to be 20 to 30% less or worse, based off the climate models and based off of recent evidence, by the way. This year is going to be pretty horrendous across the southwestern United States. I just came back from the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado, and they're at 20% of normal snowpack there. There's no snow in the mountains. And you have a huge farming community that's dependent upon that snow melting and coming down to. I think a really important shift has been toward thinking about what we call conjunctive water use, which is not relying solely on surface water reservoirs, but taking some of the high flows, some of the storm runoff, some of the flood peak water, and capturing that, shaping that, and getting it injected underground and storing it underground. Because you're not then losing so much of your storage water to evaporation. About 15 to 20% of all the water flowing down the Colorado River evaporates off those big reservoirs. So that's not a good idea. So there's different ways of storing water. That's my conclusion there. And underground, of course, is much, much better in conjunctive use. Aquifer storage and recovery, we also call it. If you want to talk about reservoirs from an ecological sustainability, then I would give you a different answer. Reservoirs are very, very disruptive and damaging to river ecosystems. There's no way to get around that. They block the movement of animals upstream and downstream. They block the flow of nutrients and sediments and organic material from upstream to downstream. And that happens, those problems don't go away just because you build a smaller dam, many smaller dams instead of one large dam. It's a really, really serious problem. And so I think that we can do a lot to improve the way that existing reservoirs are being managed and operated. That's a very, very active thing now with the shifting climate and because of these ecological impacts. And so I think we can do a lot better with what we have. my push is on getting us to stop thinking about reservoirs as being the solution going forward. We got to work on the other side. We got to work on the demand management side, because there's no more water. We're not going to gain any more water by building more reservoirs. Kind of danced around. I hope I got to at least the essence of what you want. Let's go here, and then I'll come over there, and then over here.
Hi, my name is Rubio, and I just wanted to ask you, we're mainly here talking about a sustainable relationship between agriculture and urban activity.
Yeah.
But how does deforestation play in this issue as our population continues to grow, and what can be done about it?
I'm sorry, I missed. Did you say deforestation or
Deforestation.
deforestation? All right, yeah, it's a good point, and one that a lot of the conservation organizations and a lot of the governmental agencies are working on now. So the way that we care for the landscape, that is ultimately the source of our water. It's where the rainfall or the snowfall comes down onto the landscape and then crosses some of it. Of course, enters into the soils out there in the watersheds, and a lot of it will run off. And the condition of that landscape, where that water is falling, has a lot to do with the water that ends up down in the downstream river or lake or percolates down to the groundwater aquifer. It's extremely important on the water quality side. We've demonstrated a number of organizations. The organization that I was with for 30 years, the Nature Conservancy, has been doing a lot of work on this, but there's many, many other groups that are doing really important work on watershed protection and the relationship to the important breakthrough here in the last decade has been being able to demonstrate economically that an investment in watershed protection translates to a positive cost-benefit ratio in terms of savings, in terms of how you have to treat that water before you serve it out to your communities, or to put it even in agricultural water supplies. So that there's been a lot of progress on that economic cost-benefit argument. It also, of course, has a lot of environmental advantages because you're protecting habitat at the same time. So I think that's very, very important. On the quantity side, to be really honest with you, it's mixed, and we have to be careful because sometimes reforesting an area can end up in a net reduction in the amount of water that is actually draining out of that watershed because that vegetation is taking some portion of it. So so be careful about this assumption, and I had to warn my organization for the Nature Conservancy about this. You can't just blanket say it's going to improve water quality and water yield. Water quality, yeah, that's a great bet. That's a high probability. But on the water yield, you have to do the science to really figure out whether or not you're going to come out ahead or behind. But even if you're just maintaining the same level, or even if you're not getting as much water, the fact that you're getting cleaner water can be very, very important to a lot of communities. Great question. You had one back here, and I'll come over there.
Yeah, I know that lack of federal guidance for risk-based standards and treatment standards for greywater and stormwater. It's kind of led to a lot of variability at the state and local level of acceptance, implementation.
Yeah.
Do you feel, us here at the federal level, should we look at tasking EPA with the task force to create a federal guidance?
Yeah.
Would that be effective?
Yes. I think that's a great idea. There are a lot of communities, so I teach at the University of Virginia. We have a terrific architecture school and a terrific engineering school there. And what you hear in the hallways there and in the presentations there are some, the world is moving very, very fast toward net zero energy, and even on the water side. It's absolutely amazing. In fact, DOE, on DOE's website, you can go and find things about net zero water, of all things. The potential is there. We can get to remarkably low levels of water use within cities and farms, and that's why I feel comfortable, talking about the things that I just did. But there are local, state, and federal impediments to those things: the water recycling, the stormwater capture, gray water use at a residential level. The technological and engineering and architectural capabilities of doing it are there, and the schools training those professions, that's where they're going. But they're hitting this wall right now of being able to go into implementation. So yeah, terrific point. Terrific point. Now your turn over here.
So what are your thoughts on desalination?
Yeah.
Water plants that turn seawater to fresh water, would that help and mitigate?
Yeah, so the question is about desalination. You know, a lot of people view it as a silver bullet, and it does have a lot of potential. Right now, it's only providing about 2% of the world's water supply, so it's a really, really small contributor right now. The primary reason for that, so particularly if we talk about coastal cities, it can make a lot of sense. If you're a city that's really pushed on these other things to the max, Los Angeles, San Diego, you know, up and down the coast of California, but you know, many, many other areas around the world, I argue that you first go after all the demand management side, and only when you've really done an honest, exhaustive effort on that should you start talking about desalination. The reason for that is desalination is extremely expensive, and it's going to stay that way, even though people will talk about technological advances and new, you know, membranes. So desalination basically takes a gallon of salty water, and there's different ways of doing it. The primary way is to run it through a filter membrane, a slightly permeable material, and out the other side comes a half a gallon of clean, pure, fresh water. Pushing the water through the membrane requires a tremendous amount of energy, which means electricity, and that means a great expense. So desalination is about 10 times more than most other forms of water supply. And again, it's going to come down. It has been coming down, but it's not going to get down to be, you know, financially competitive. The other problem with desalination, which is very active out in where Ben works out in California, is how do you dispose of that other half gallon that now has become extremely salty? They call it brine. It's an intensely salty, concentrated solution. And disposing of that in an environmentally safe way can be really challenging. Again, if you're on the ocean, the technology's there to get it far out into the ocean with pipes that disperse it, you know, out there and doesn't concentrate it, and arguably can avoid harm to marine life, but it has to be done well. And that can add some expense to doing it well. And that's the reason there's resistance in California, is both on the energy side. And of course, most of the energy is still coming from you know, non-renewables. So, but we do see a really interesting trend in a number of different places where the local citizenry is demanding that desal be done on renewables only. That was the case in Adelaide, Australia. They said, okay, you can build a desalination plant, but you got to do it all on renewables, and they did. There's a lot of communities doing that. Saudi Arabia, which has built half of all the desalination capacity in the world, is now going to completely solar-driven desalination, and that's an interesting trend too. So, it can be strategic and appropriate in the situation, but it's really expensive and has some environmental challenges, so exhaust the demand side first before you go there. Yes, there's a couple. You were first, and I'll come back. Yeah.
What is your opinion on the negative environmental impacts of privatization of water and bottled water?
Yeah. So people talk about, boy, this is a loaded one. If I squirm during any question, it's that one, and I get asked every time I give a public talk. So we talk about privatization in some kind of loose and sometimes inappropriate ways. Let me just start there. So for example, is it also privatization when you take 11.5 ounces of water and put it into a can of Coca-Cola? So part of it is that, is sort of, you know, from the commercial standpoint when you get into, so what aspects of commercial use of water and provision of food and beverages do we call privatization and not? And we have labeled bottled water as being privatization oftentimes, but not the other uses of water. So there's a little bit of an issue there. The more common and I think more appropriate or interesting argument about privatization is the case in which particularly cities have, for whatever reason, decided to issue a contract to a private commercial company to take over their water and wastewater services. Okay? There's a lot of cities in the U.S. have done that, and a lot of places around the world that are doing that. There's myriad reasons why cities would make that choice. You know, the fact that Atlanta at one time was, you know, contracted to a private company is an illustration where, for various reasons, cities, you know, may not have the technological expertise or capacity. Maybe they're having trouble, on the financing stream to be able to maintain a, financially sustainable operations of the systems. Where it gets into trouble, so my balanced, response to this is I think there is potential for a private role in the management of water services. It is important to bring private capital in, and sometimes that can be very helpful as a match with public funding. But the conditions under which those agreements are entered into need to be very, very carefully executed. The big problem, the one that's been sensationalized for good reason, is that when the private companies come in, the rates often go way up. Now, those companies will tell you that the reason that the rates went up is because the city, the public utilities, have gotten so far behind on taking care of the infrastructure. They've got leaky pipes everywhere, and dams are about to fail, and that sort of thing, that the private company has to make so much investment in that deteriorated infrastructure that needs to be rehabilitated that that's going to be a lot of cost, and therefore all they're doing is taking that backload of debt that had accrued under the public management of the system, and they're now monetizing it and charging it in your rates. So that would be their argument, and it's justifiable to some extent. But there's also a profit-seeking motive, of course, and that has gotten those relationships into serious trouble, and for good reason. And so I think, I don't dismiss it out of hand as being an evil thing, but you have to have the capability within the local government to execute that kind of a contract that prevents against the abuses, of the charges. And unfortunately, this is the irony, of course, is that the communities that are oftentimes going to privatization don't have the governance capabilities in the first place, and so they have trouble executing the appropriate contract to protect them against that. You had a question in the back here.
Talking about energy and desalination.
Yeah.
Can you speak to energy and just pumping water nationally?
Yes.
In California also, and I read that pumping water in California, the energy used to do that would power 250,000 homes.
Yeah, so great, thank you. See, this is reading all of this, because you never know what to say in a presentation, so I try to get through them quickly so that you can have, you can hit on all the other things that are of interest to you. So the question is about electricity use he was saying in pumping specifically, but the energy use in water extraction and distribution and storage is a massive component of our overall electricity use. I think in Southern California, it's about a third of the electricity use, something on that order. Some of the biggest water user biggest electricity user in California is the State Water Project, I believe. In Arizona, it's the Central Arizona Project. So, water infrastructure, moving water uphill against gravity is very, very expensive. So the same thing with wells. So if you're having to pump water from underground, it takes a lot of electricity to do it. And this is another bit about sustainability of management of groundwater aquifers. As the level of the aquifer goes down because you're using too much, it's not being recharged at the same rate that you're pulling it out, the water level drops and your electricity cost goes up very, very quickly. And in fact, that's putting a lot of farmers out of business. In the Ogallala, the High Plains aquifer, farmers are going out of business because they can't afford the electricity bill to pump it out of the ground because it's gotten to be so deep. Or they're having to build a new well to keep chasing water. Over there. I'll stay as long as you all want to, by the way.
So it seems to me that a lot of what the government does in terms of involvement in sustainability is very much on a large scale, where it's like, what are cities doing in terms of sustainability, and what is the agricultural industry as a whole is doing. I'm also from California, and with the recent drought, it appeared to me that a lot of people were very much disconnected with, yes, they realized that there was a really bad drought going on. Obviously, it was really hot, whatever. But they weren't really cognizant of their own personal water usage.
Yeah.
So would you say that there are ways for the different levels of government to kind of help people realize how their own water usage impacts sustainability?
Yes. Yes. Terrific question. And that's why one of my recommendations, policy recommendations, was to really pay attention to getting that expertise and capacity into those local communities somehow. I don't, I'm not going to be prescriptive about how that funding gets to them, but again, that kind of expertise needs to be brought in because they're not only good at the engineering or the technology aspects of the water conservation, but water conservation is ultimately a social challenge, right? So you have social scientists, that are in those positions, and they understand sort of the psychologies of how do you get people to shift their behaviors, and that's a really, really important part of this. There's a lot of cities that have done some really progressive things with their rate structures too, and there's nothing that gets the individual consumers, at least most of them, than to see their water bills go up. My parents in San Diego ripped out their lawns, front and back, not because their son is a water conservation person, but because their water bill went up so much. So they had to save some money on a fixed income or retired. They watched me around the neighborhood. There are people in San Diego and probably happening in other parts of the Southwest where people are ripping out swimming pools because the amount of water evaporating off the swimming pool. They took me around, there was a big bulldozer in the next door neighbor's yard, and they're pulling out their swimming pool. So the rate structures can be an important mechanism, important part of the conservation overall. You have to be careful, though, with rate structures so that you're not outpricing the lower economic strata, of our communities. Water affordability is a monstrously big issue here in the United States and overseas. I had a group of students last semester, and we did some analysis on this. Every single city that we looked at more than 20 across the United States. Every single city had at least 20%, and many of them over 40% of the citizens who, according to the EPA guidelines on what's water affordability levels, they were not affordable for a fifth to more than a third of the communities. By the way, that measure is if 4.5% of your income, if more than 4.5% of your income is going to paying your water bill, then it's EPA deems it as being unaffordable. So that's the metric that was used there. Thanks. So, by the way, in the book, I have a whole chapter on sort of local communities, really the importance of local communities to really lead on all of this. I sort of refer to it as water democracies, local water democracies. And so facilitation of stakeholder participation is a very big part of this game, to bring in the citizenry, give them access, hear their voices and opinions, rather than making it a centralized engineering exercise, but instead, spreading some of the responsibility and some of the ownership and some of the opportunity to the citizens through public participation is important. Yes?
You talked about stormwater capture being one of the ways to help cities for water shortages. When cities implement those strategies, are the aquifers having trouble in recharging? Do those rates go down? And what is kind of the effect downstream of that stormwater capture?
That's great. Wonderful question. So, are there some unintended consequences with some of these things? And the answer is yes. You have to be careful about it. And so, in the book and when I talk, I give a lot of emphasis to follow the water, really understand the water budget. So, if previously, I'll just walk you through a really simple, quick example. If previously, so in our cities, in our homes, inside the house, about 95% of the water that we use goes down the drains, down the toilet, down the shower, down the sink, and ends up usually going back to the original water source after it gets treated, ideally, or hopefully. So it replenishes, we call it return flow. It returns back to the original source and it replenishes, that source so that, our consumptive loss, the amount that we're depleting that water source, might be minimal. But if you then say, hey, we're going to, instead of releasing that water back to its original source, we're going to use it again and use it over and over again. We're going to use it out on our outdoor landscaping and that sort of thing. Then you no longer have that return flow going back to the original water source, whether it's groundwater or surface water. And you can get yourself into trouble that way, ironically. By trying to do the right green thing, by recycling water, you can actually deplete the water source greater than it was being done previously. Now, cities that discharge out to the ocean, it's arguably that's kind of like a no regrets sort of a thing. But no, it's a great question. got to follow the water, got to do the water budget, and pay attention to where the water was going, where it's going to go after you make the changes. Yeah. In the back over here.
In the neighborhood I grew up in Colorado, the homeowners association mandated grass. You couldn't put in a native landscape. Are there communities that, or states or local communities that have legislative solutions to that, like saying homeowners associations can't make those rules? And let's say if that happened, how much would an impact be made if everyone who wanted to have native landscaping actually could do it? Or would it really kind of not affect much?
Well, you're right. You're hitting on a really important point, and it circles back to some of what we said earlier about sort of local ordinance impediments, but it can also be homeowners association covenants. I grew up next to an association like that in San Diego, and I'll never forget when I was in my teenage years that one of the homeowners in that community was ahead of their time, and they went to native landscaping, and the rest of the neighbors freaked out, and they were able to use the covenants, to get them to forcefully put a lawn in. So I understand that problem, and it is an issue. And I think we're seeing a lot less of that because of the awareness that's building around water scarcity, water shortages, and that the public's getting educated on how much water gets used outside. But back to your point, education of the general public is such a huge part of that. It's why I wrote this book. I wrote it for my parents, because again, we don't have conversations where they're learning a lot from me. But this is just one book. We need really coordinated, active campaigns to try to really get the general public to really understand the precious scarcity of water, and also what some of the ways that we can address that and manage that going forward. So any kind of marketing campaigns are going to be really, really important, and public education campaigns. So that's the tide is shifting. It's just not shifting fast enough on that awareness. So one more. I'll take one more, and then how about if we call it quits, please?
You mentioned the quantification settlement agreement between San Diego and the Imperial Conservation District.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's a model that could potentially be exported to other watersheds, and if so, what do you think are the lessons learned from that agreement?
Say the last part again.
Do you think that's the quantification agreement is a model that could be exported to other watersheds, and if so, what do you think are the lessons learned from that agreement?
So apparently you know a lot about the background about sort of what really kind of drove that. Was what was it called? The Quantified Settlement Agreement, QSA. Yeah. Anyway, was when Secretary Babbitt was in the Interior, right? And so basically, the issue was that California was using more than its fair share of the Colorado River. So Babbitt finally came in with the hammer and said, you're now going to start living within the limits of your allocation of the Colorado River. And that caused a lot of the cities and some of the farming districts to react and try to get their water demands under control. And that was one of the things that drove San Diego to think creatively about working with the Imperial Irrigation District. There are so few models of like perfect public policy, right? I think things that can kind of encourage and enable those kinds of collaborative solutions are really, really important. In the implementation, if you put the looking glass on it, you're going to find problems and warts in all of them. The big one, of course, with that one is that as the farmers in the Imperial Irrigation District have become more efficient, there's not as much return flow draining to the Salton Sea. And so the Salton Sea is now shrinking very, very rapidly and causing all kinds of problems. The lakeshore is getting exposed, this alkali dust is blowing up and causing tremendous health problems around the Salton Sea. So it's not perfect. That wasn't adequately dealt with at the time, But again, all the quantified settlement said was, California, you got to live within your rights. And so it was a catalytic piece of public policy. So in that respect, it was good. And I think we need catalysts to try to both encourage and to push communities and states into getting their water use under control. Hopefully more of the incentives than the regulatory. Yeah, thanks for the question. Thank you all. You've been very attentive and you asked some terrific questions and kept me on my toes. Thanks a lot.